such that they can make those future purchases and predict future events. This is something they cannot do currently at a point at which it is very uncertain. For example, when they don't know whether or not money is going to come from the US president over the next few months. This is something that is uniquely exclusive to our side because we provide funds that their side cannot. Under their side, what they have to do is that they either have to rely on a few things. Either they rely on the Ukrainian funds themselves, which are exceptionally low compared to Russia, and with millions of people already fleeing Ukraine and the most rich and wealthy and talented already leaving the country, they cannot rely on that. The other alternative is to simply rely on EU countries themselves. And we've already seen that they are less and less willing over time to sponsor Ukraine because this issue is no longer on their radar. Look at the recent EU Parliament elections, for example, where oftentimes we see candidates running against funding Ukraine. Finally, we think that actually the US is very likely to pull out in the future, especially given that there is simply less attention on this issue and simply because of the unpredictability of the US system of government of Congress to be able to push forward a 6-month loan. For these reasons, we think that the consistency of funds, we explained to, is really important. It's something that only happens on our side. It's because of both volume and consistency that we win the funding issue in this debate. Let's move on then to the second issue of the Russian response. I will argue to you that Russia likely responds positively. They are not going to do something as extreme as a nuclear option. This is because if they simply use nukes over this issue, they lose perhaps the largest piece of leverage they have in this entire issue, and therefore something that actually is not that important for them to begin with. This is simply not something which is likely to tip them over. For example, they are likely more able to use something like a sliding scale impacts. For example, doing something like more saber rattling on the Cuban issue. They are also less likely to escalate in Ukraine. The reason being that they already cannot further escalate in Ukraine because they are already at the maximum capacity. They've already mobilized all of the males of fighting age in Russia. They already lack resources because they've already spent all of the ammunition and their factories are already all producing those kinds of bullets. Wagner, for example, their sub-military contractors have already been co-opted and are already involved in this. Therefore, it's very unlikely that they are able to push forward or expand their response even more in response to what the EU is doing under our policy. For these reasons, their side cannot argue that Russia's response is likely to be extremely antagonistic. What we explain instead is that Putin is actually more likely to come to the negotiating table behind closed doors under our side of the house. Why? Two reasons. Firstly, because we have lots of willing negotiators under our side of the house. Many countries, from India and Narendra Modi, where he actually claimed to be able to solve the Ukraine-Russia war, or countries like Turkey, like Greece, like all of these, Indonesia even, for example, all of these countries want to be able to prove that they can resolve this conflict. Therefore, more parties are actually willing to do it under our side of the house, at the point which they see that the EU is something so invested within this policy. But moreover, under our side of the house, we actually give Putin a reason and an ability to leave the war. Putin actually does not want to be bogged down with this conflict, something that will actually taint his legacy if he does not win, and he's simply afraid of being seen as the one capitulating to the West. Under our side of the house, we actually allow him to blunt the effect that this leaving has on his credibility, because he can accuse Europe of having played his hand and having done so. The fact is that closed-door negotiations, by virtue of the fact that they are not public, allow him the ability to leave without such an urgency or such embarrassment. At the end of the day, we must admit that Putin is currently facing huge amounts of domestic pressure. And that's why he's visiting places of desperation, the DPRK, Vietnam, etc., places that are not the military powerhouses of the world simply to collect material, suggesting that he already is desperate. At the end of the day, Putin is already at his limits. The Russian response cannot be scaled infinitely. What can be scaled upwards is our ability to fund them and our ability to keep Russians and Ukrainians safe. For these reasons, we're extremely proud.
Thanks for that speech. I'd now like to invite First Negative.
Sorry, let me set a timer. Time starts in 3, 2, 1. Firstly, some background on this topic. The Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2023 resulted in fierce offensive pushing into Ukraine all the way almost into the capital of Kiev, where Ukrainian forces held their ground, pushing Russia all the way back almost to the border. The stalemate between Russia and Ukraine, where neither side is gaining real ground, has continued over the past few months. And the US and the EU has been sending a lot of military aid, including funding, weapons, intelligence, but they have not put any troops on the ground. And fourthly, they have frozen Russian assets in the EU using targeted sanctions and are now using such assets to fund the war effort in Ukraine. And what is this debate about? On our side, we need to prove that we should support that. On our side, we need to prove that we shouldn't support transferring frozen assets to Ukraine. We shouldn't wait. Sorry. The EU will continue to support Ukraine using its own military resources and can add on more if it is required. But they shouldn't be touching the frozen Russian assets, as those should be diverted to the EU's own needs. And this is the topic of why the EU shouldn't transfer these assets or profits to Ukraine. Firstly, because the EU needs this money more. And secondly, because by doing so will escalate this conflict. Firstly, to deal with the economic crisis caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russia has cut down on gas supply to the EU, causing prices of energy to skyrocket. The EU, especially France and Germany, had to fork out huge subsidies to keep prices affordable. This means that alternative sources of gas shipped from Qatar and Iraq are also quite expensive, and overall, they need this money. The EU economic crisis of post-COVID recession, there is investment needed to rebuild the region, and business subsidies, agricultural subsidies, growing SMEs. There's transitioning to alternative energy sources and the rebuilding of trade routes around Russian blockades of grain in the Black Sea, along with military support already committed to Ukraine. Principle of reparations include that Russia is unilaterally committed a crime of aggression. This costs the EU dearly, not just economically, and the EU is owed a reparative duty directly from Russian assets owned by Russian oligarchies that directly contributed to, or at best, complicit in Putin's movement to invade. Secondly, by offering the frozen Russian assets to Ukraine, you would be escalating conflicts. And we recognize that in their first speech, they mentioned how they wouldn't because it has already escalated to the extent that it cannot any further. However, there is a point that current conflicts has not involved the troops of other countries, and this would be likely if you continue to help the Ukraine in further ways and would just overall escalate conflict. Here's why. Firstly, Russia has strong ideological reasons to fight this war. It's tied to their image as the fatherland. There's political reasons as having Ukraine as a buffer state against NATO. And it's already committed. It can't afford to back out right now. Secondly, if they actually see Ukraine getting a military boost, it would be very likely to escalate on their end as well. There's two rogue actors within Asia, China and India. These two countries have been buying Russian oil but not publicly supporting the Russian invasion. And with the balance of power tipping towards the east, there is the rise of BRICS and ASEAN. These two Asian powerhouses, China and India, will, if any of them see the opportunity, they would choose to commit their resources to the war. And China has the largest military in the world, dwarfing the US last year. And India also has a significant standing army. If for any reason any escalation in this war leads to these two countries joining in, then it could result in a large or significant escalation. The impact of this is that war is overall likely to escalate, and Russian forces are doubling down. If conventional tactics have not worked, they will opt for more extreme measures. For example, chemical warfare, like Agent Orange used in Vietnam and Syria, or nuclear bombing. Russia will use mutually assured destruction if they are losing. And thirdly, committing war crimes, including the use of long-range ICBMs. It could also result in much worse, with much more death and destruction than is currently being caused right now. Comparatively, we understand that Ukraine and Russia are currently in a stalemate, with neither side gaining ground. However, here is why we should leave it as it is, or why a stalemate would be better than any escalation. Beyond the harms of escalation that we mentioned earlier, there is also the fact that in a battle of attrition, Russia is slowly bleeding out because of the geographical distance just transport supplies to troops. At some point, Russia will be at a severe disadvantage. And we should be keeping it this way, using guerrilla attacks on supply lines to slowly bleed Russia out, instead of trying to escalate the conflict to finish earlier. Lastly, there's a utility of funds, with Ukraine having strong incentive to liquidate assets and invest it in the war effort. This will lead to more problems, and the alternative choice is to keep it and to keep the assets frozen or to invest in other things. Since after the war, post-war reconstruction will be the most significant cost on Ukraine, and the EU also needs to have the resources to support the reconstruction and get Ukraine back on its feet. It is better to use it to build than to destroy. So overall, we believe that it is simply more beneficial if we use these assets to, one, help the EU as it is desperately in need of this money, and two, if we were to use this frozen asset on Ukraine, we believe it should be saved for the rebuilding of Ukraine, as that will have a higher cost than what the Ukraine is currently needing. For these reasons, we oppose.
Thanks for that speech, and now I'd like to invite second F.
Hello, am I audible and visible?
Yup.
That's great. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. An interesting observation I want to point out from the first negative case from the get-go is that their case is that they want to direct this additional money towards EU issues, but they also want to maintain a stalemate in Ukraine. But in the same breath, they tell us that EU issues matter more than whatever is happening in the Ukrainian front. And so I would believe that on their side, in order to stay consistent, they would divert the money that they are currently sending towards Ukrainian help, towards their own domestic issues, because presumably the German middle class matters so much more than the Ukrainian that's dying on the front line. Their side is inconsistent in the get-go. 2 points of contention in the House today. Firstly, what is the true situation in the Russia-Ukraine war? And secondly, how is the EU situation matching up in weighing? And I'll prove an independent path to victory and contribution at the end of this. The first idea is the situation in the war. The crucial misconception that exists on negative side is that this current war is not in an indefinite stalemate. In fact, Russia is currently in the advantage. Why is this the case? It's because of the 6-month gap that existed in Congress Congress gridlock, and also in the EU, where Viktor Orban consistently voted against aid to be sent to Ukraine. This means that currently Russia is in an advantage in a large portion of the country where they're able to win via attrition because Ukraine doesn't have the forces right now. In fact, what Russia is doing right now is that they're advancing their offensive because they know that any US aid will only come at the end of the year. So they're trying to do as much as they can before this aid comes into play. The crucial takeaway from this is that funding is an incredibly important player within this war. That is to say that there is still a possibility to shift this war insofar as more funding is able to provide things like Caleb told you, things like air missiles, things like strikes, things like the ability to take out tanks, take out infrastructure, take out front lines from the Russian army. This is incredibly important because they gave you reasons as to why the front line is currently being balanced because of the aid from other countries. Listen to what Caleb tells you in his first affirmative speech. He tells you that other countries, the volume of aid that's coming from the EU, from the West, from all these other countries, is what is keeping the war in the balance right now. If this is taken away on the negative side, I'm unsure as to why the stalemate continues to exist. But the main thing that first negative actually questions us on is, can the situation actually improve? This is incredibly uncomparative to whatever Caleb told you, but I'll just restate the 3 reasons as to why this is actually beneficial. The first is that money can directly buy technology that can shift the scales of the war. This looks like buying more missiles, for example, that's able to take down enemy infrastructure. This is like, for example, more mine detection in order to prevent infantry troops from dying. Even if we don't buy, for example, that better technology happens, we are able to help more soldiers on the ground. We bring more humanitarian aid, more resources, more food, more supplies for them, such that they have a higher morale and a higher survival rate in the brutal Russian winters. This is incredibly important because it means that regardless of whether the situation is in a stalemate or not, you'll believe that there's still a positive delta on the outside, insofar as you're still able to help citizens and soldiers on the ground. Therefore, even if it is in a stalemate, there's always a possibility for us to reverse this. The crucial nail biter here, and the crucial thing that takes down the opposition case, is that this is consistent aid. This isn't a one-off aid from the US. This is a one-off aid package from the EU. This is consistent $50 billion of aid that is flowing into Ukrainian pockets every single year. This is incredibly important, both on the Ukrainian psyche and the Russian psyche. From the Russian side, they aren't just dealing with a one-off aid package that they can just deal with by sending forces in to die. They have to deal with the fact that they constant war of attrition that they're now going to lose. On the other side, from the Ukrainians, there's more morale to fight now. Not that they feel that the West and they feel that the EU is more willing to support and stand behind them. Therefore, this is incredibly beneficial for them to benefit the situation on the ground. But what does negative do to try and weigh this against? They try and give two main ideas here. The first is that there's India and China that will join the war. The second is the idea of war crimes. Let's deal with both of them. The first is India and China. Never mind the fact that there's no mechanism here, apart from the fact that India and China have some sparing relations with Russia, but recognize that neither of these countries are going to sacrifice their international relations for Russia. This is incredibly important because India and China have other vast sources of economic gain and other forms of vast international relations with other countries. In fact, India and China both have a very vested incentive to continue maintaining a positive relationship with the West because their economies is heavily interlinked. Therefore, there is no reason for them to sacrifice all of these ties and burn all of these bridges for a country or an ally that is not integral to their own country's national security in the first place. Absent of a mechanism, this point just simply doesn't stand. The second is on the idea of war crimes. Again, notwithstanding the fact that Russia already commits war crimes within these areas, we already told you how Russia cannot scale this aggression any further because they're suffering from a lack of ability. Their economy is strained, their manpower and their industries are strained. And so the ability for them to continue scaling aggression going into the future is heavily limited by the finances they have right now. Compare this to our side, where funding is increased and therefore they are better able to combat these sources as well. This therefore means that if there's any that number one, you will believe that Russian war crimes doesn't actually escalate on both sides because there's a vested incentive not to do so. But secondly, if it was really the idea of tear gas and all those types of things, in fact, our side is the one that can provide more funding to deal with defensive measures, things like gas masks, for example, mandatory for soldiers in the trenches for them to be able to deal with these problems. Therefore, there's more protection for soldiers, and you will believe that the war doesn't actually escalate under their side. But this goes into the second point of contention, the EU situation. So the first thing that I want to note at the top of this response is that they admit that taking assets is legal. So there's not something the second negative or third negative can push as an outcome. The main thing that we want to take away from here is four responses. The first, EU already uses windfall taxes from increased gas prices during the period of crisis of the Ukraine war. And so they're already able to gain an increased amount of funding to deal with these problems. The second is that it's not actually justified. Listen to the language they tell you. They tell you it's a reparative duty because the EU has been harmed by the Russia-Ukraine invasion. Who is harmed more? The people who live within EU countries or the Ukrainians on the ground who have their homelands invaded and need this problem to be solved. We just don't think the reparative burden exists to the same level as to Ukraine. Given that there's direct harm, we think that reparation is significantly better solved under our side. The third is that we'll just take the trade-off and weigh. We will weigh the German middle class that now suffers from greater inflation and lower wages versus the Ukrainian who is dying on the ground from suffering from the invasion of their homeland, the invasion of their rights, which is the highest form of invasion as a result of war, the highest form of dignity that's being taken away. We think that nothing comes close to the suffering that's being taken on the ground. The last thing that I want to state here, just what I stated in this preamble, which is why not just completely abandon Ukraine anyways. In fact, the fact that you continue to want to support them implicitly means that in some cases they think that Ukraine is more important. This is already a principal concession within their case. But before that, as of all of these things, I'll bring to you a unique path to victory in the contribution I have today. Why is there an increased amount of global unity under affirmative side in the fight against Russia? Currently, a large amount of countries are unwilling to buy into support into Russia because they fear other connections to other related countries like China, as they rightly point out. On the outside, more countries are likely to buy in and show solidarity as they see the support of a major bloc in the EU. Crucially, not just the US, because supporting a side that is unilaterally supported by the US generally paints you as someone who is overly aligned with the West and overly aligned with the US. The fact that they are supporting another major bloc in the EU suggests that there's actually a large amount of global solidarity that stands behind these countries. This looks like an increased amount of participation in things like the Swiss summit. There are three impacts that results from this. The first is an increased amount of global aid that now flows into Ukraine on top of the EU's aid towards them. The second is an increased amount of economic isolation and sanctions. And the third is that it pushes belligerents towards the global community. It means that belligerents now seeing the global attachment or the global attention towards this issue are now more willing to support and more willing to tend towards the global community, seeing the response that is likely going to be invoked. At the end of the day, let's present the way. under our side, under their side, the extent of their benefit is that they're going to have more aid going towards EU countries. But recognize that this amount of money, when dispersed across all EU member states, and especially considering the fact that a lot of them are currently being supported by far-right parties, is quite likely to be dispersed across a wide variety of individuals, and the amount of delta on each person is far smaller. Recognize that the delta on our side is far more concentrated and far more beneficial. It means one more soldier survives on the front lines, one more ration is given to individuals, one more person who's surviving a missile strike. There's crucial benefits that allows more lives to be saved on the ground and always wins on net, considering that these people are the most vulnerable individuals, people who had their lives, their families, their homelands, everything taken from them. We must protect.
Great, thanks for that speech. And now I'd like to invite the second neg.
All right, great. Starting now. The first question I want to answer is who should best utilize the resources from frozen Russian assets? Because I don't know why this affirmative team kind of expected us to defend the rights of Russia. We didn't think so. We think that the frozen assets that's currently in EU is a great resource. We're not sure why the EU wants to pour it into Ukraine, into like a war zone, a war of attrition where the resources just goes to disappear. So the first question is in terms of who should utilize the resources better. Is it the EU or is it Ukraine? I want to observe at the top that the EU and the US are already supporting Ukraine right now. They're committing a couple $2 billion over the past 2 years. They will still continue supporting Ukraine because of the geopolitical interests, because of all the moral reasons that the affirmative identifies. The question in this round is whether they should continue providing a line of support, noting that the amount of support to Ukraine is much less than the profits from Russian assets. So according to the info slide, the assets are providing an annual income of like what, $3 billion or something like that. The EU does not spend that much money on aid towards Ukraine. I think, okay, maybe considerable considering the past 2 years, but moving into the future, it's much more likely that the amount of money from those assets is more than amount of money that you commit towards Ukraine. Also noting that Ukrainians right now don't need that much resources to survive. And if it's true that the EU and the US are cutting back in terms of military aid and moving more towards humanitarian aid to giving them food and supply and stuff, that is enough to sustain the situation as it is now. And the EU is perfectly free to do that. If they really need the money, we're very happy for the EU to liquidate these assets and take the money and help their own people. It's in line with our principles. So I think in terms of the setup, that's how it's going to happen. We are still going to support Ukraine a little bit. The money that comes from Russian assets is a lot more, and everything else will be diverted towards the EU people. Okay, why do we do this? The first thing we explained was because the EU deserves reparation from Russia. The invasion of Ukraine cost the EU dearly in all the ways that we explained in first negative. Like the cutting off of the oil led to very high energy prices in the entire EU. And of course, it was in winter, so installation costs and heating costs just went through the roof. So all kinds of energy industries that are built on energy, the prices went up. There's a lot of cost to import like natural gas from Qatar and from other places. So all of those things just made the lives of the EU very painful. Second thing is to also note that especially at the start of the conflict, the EU committed quite significantly in terms of war efforts to helping Ukraine. And that's a cost that is borne by the EU unilaterally. The Ukraine has not been able to give back anything, I mean, for obvious reasons. But it still is the fact doesn't change that the EU committed a lot of resources to helping Ukraine right now. The deputy tells us that the EU has money because they have windfall taxes from energy, but it still just isn't enough comparing the amount of money that's been invested into like Ukraine in terms of military resources, but also the amount of money in terms of subsidies to just deal with the energy crisis that the EU face, especially at the start of the war. France and Germany is still getting lambasted locally. DPM themselves also identifies that it's a lot of right-wing governments that's existing. It is very possible that France tips towards the right wing. They're halfway, Marine Le Pen is halfway in the boat. Germany is also having some political instabilities right now. So the taxes and the resources that the EU have is not sufficient. Therefore, we claim that EU owes a duty towards the own people first. Again, I think the response saying that, the Russia has a direct reparative duty to the Ukrainian people is kind of solved by the fact that the EU has already invested a lot of resources into helping Ukraine right now. And therefore, it's like, at the start of the war, the Russian assets was used directly to fund Ukrainian war efforts. I think we'll be fine with that. But the reality is that as 2 years this war has gone by, the EU has invested I don't know how many $billions into this war. And that's why the reparative duty now falls to the EU, because the EU was the one that stood in the gap to help Russia. But I think on a practical reason as well, given the instability in the EU, given the cost of the war of the Ukrainian crisis, where you have weaker nations like Hungary on the border of the conflict that's leaning dangerously towards Russia, voting against sending aid to Russia. I think that seeing the Russian asset contribute something to the EU, it would help the perception and will also make it easier politically to move further aid mechanisms forward to help Ukraine in the future and stuff like that. So I think that the reparative duty still falls to the EU side. It still falls to the EU because the EU has helped Ukraine all this while. And even if you don't believe that this reparative duty exists, I just want to note in terms of a direct mandate, the EU has a more proximate mandate to their own people than they have to a border state that they've already been helping. And therefore, I think the EU needs to really start prioritizing themselves. That's in terms of how you weigh that moral obligations on the basis of proximity and how much work has been done before in the past. Yep. The last thing under this issue in terms of the practical outcomes of fighting the war is that the Gulf says, oh, now you give them resources, they can start pushing back against the wall of attrition and stuff like that. But they also identify and first that the terrain and the weather in Ukraine is very muddy, it's very cold winter, it's very difficult for any side to make any real advances. So I would just question the extent to which they're actually able to make advances against Russia. I think the 3 billion that they're committing, even if you commit it over the next like 5 to 10 years, is not necessarily something that will create a lot of impact. And also, like you're sustaining the war, you're not pushing Russia out. So this is again money that's being thrown into the black hole of the Ukrainian war. It's not going to win them the war. At the end of this clash, I think it's clear that the EU owes a greater principle to themselves, their own people, if not a reparative duty, then a moral democratic mandate to do so. The second question I want to answer is in terms of how will Russia react. Because the claim from F is that, this is going to force Putin to come to the table. Let's first talk about the status quo and where things exist. Both F and Gov F and NEC accepts that there's a stalemate that's happening now. Our claim from opposition is that a stalemate benefits Ukraine because if both sides are not fighting or they're only engaging in skirmishes without any real progress on either side, Russia has a higher cost of transporting supplies all the way from Moscow to the border of Russia into Ukraine to wherever they are in Donetsk and Luhansk right now. Right? So if this continues into the future, Russia is going to have to continue spending resources sending supplies. So either they will try to up the offensive, which we can see is not necessarily going to lead to a positive outcome for Russia, or they're just going to keep things as they are and not make any real advances. That's preferable, and we want to keep things that way. What happens if you transfer resources towards Ukraine and Ukraine becomes empowered? We're likely to see a response from Russia's allies. DPM doesn't really engage with the mechanism that we explained because people like China and India have stayed out of it for now. But we explained that the incentive of China and India, even if they have international relations with other nations, is to first and foremost prioritize their own geopolitical influence. And I want to be clear, as much as China's economy is intertwined with the West, China does not stand to support the Western economy. China does not stand to support a Trump presidency that's trying to pull manufacturing jobs away from China or like outside and bring it back towards Malaysia. Trump is cracking down on Huawei and other Chinese companies like ByteDance and TikTok. China does not have interest to protect by siding with the West. What this means, therefore, is that again, given the US on the brink of Trump's presidency and the EU is already in a pretty significant debt crisis, India and China are on the rise right now. With ASEAN and the South Asian markets on the rise, China's investment in green technology, solar panels, EVs, and all that stuff, China and India can see this as an opportunity to continue to drain the Western's resources. This is likely to be the tipping point for them either to step in the war, boots on the ground, and thoroughly wipe out Ukrainian defense, or they don't even need to put boots on the ground. They can give them support. India is already buying Russian oil at a premium. Not really a premium, but they are buying Russian oil, right? China is giving some military support towards Russia. They can continue to amp it up to keep draining these resources. It is very unlikely that Putin comes to the table. So even if we don't win the war on our side of the house, at least we preserve the stalemate, and that's still a better use of that resources. Proud to oppose.
Right, and now third affirmative.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I'll start in a couple of seconds. I want to note here the inconsistent characterization that underlines the case shift presented us in second opposition. Second opposition tells us on the one hand that the Russian artillery and the Russian military effort is so strong that giving Ukraine more arms won't actually materially change the front line. They say it's so hard to beat them in the snow-covered fields, for example. Therefore, there's no incentive to give them more weapons because they can't win the war anyway. On the other hand, they also tell us that actually, money goes towards Ukraine is a waste because it's a stalemate anyway, if you don't give Ukraine money at all, they can, or the current levels of money they're going to commit on their side of the house, things won't materially change because if you give Ukraine less money, they won't lose the war anyway because that's the nature of a stalemate. Notice therefore that firstly, there is an inherent tension in their case. And I suspect what really is more close to reality is that the reason why the stalemate is maintained right now is because of high levels of funding that has happened and is looking to wane in the future. And that's why we require our level of sustained funding from our policy that is unique to side government. But secondly, and more importantly, right, notice that a lot of second opposition's arguments rely on the assumption that Ukraine can still survive and keep its relative stalemate state without additional EU funding, because all of his comparatives say that it is throwing money away in Ukraine for no change whatsoever versus some marginal increase in EU fuel subsidies that are being funded by taking away this interest on these foreign Russian assets. Therefore, at the point at which we have proven to you that there's some degree of change that does occur for Ukrainian lives on the ground as a result of some degree of funding from this interest on Russian assets, then we prove that there is a positive benefit on side government, and therefore we need third opposition to actually give a way of what the true trap into this debate actually is. So I'll talk about two issues in this round. Firstly, about the Ukrainian situation looks like, and secondly, what the EU situation looks like. So let's talk about the Ukraine situation at first. And look at the inherent assumption that underlines the case. They tell us in first speaker that you want to keep a stalemate in status quo, yet also retain some funding for future reconstruction by subsidizing Ukraine. I'm not entirely sure what's going on there. But crucially, I want to point out to you two things. Firstly, I'm going to directly engage with the implicit assumption in the opposition case that you don't need to give them more funding for them to maintain the stalemate and not get completely obliterated by Russia. Notice that a lot of chaos material already implicitly responds to this. He tells you that right now in status quo, right, the stalemate exists because no side is able to maintain air dominance. Air dominance means I cannot fly my airplane in the sky and avoid getting pew shot down by the guns on the ground, right? So notice that I can probably gain more air dominance or reduce my opponent's air dominance by buying more pews or buying more planes flying in the sky. So notice here crucial link that money is important in eroding or changing the nature of the war, even if there's a nominal stalemate right now. But more importantly, there are a lot of the Ukraine's current resources arose not as a result of inherent Ukrainian advantages, but as a result of aid being given from the past by Ukraine advantages, for example, or by Croatian like support and funding. As a result, and in comparison, right, Russian aid from other countries is fairly minimal. They get this through commandeering local production facilities or by using past stockpiles from the Soviet era. What this means is that Russia does not need external funding to continue supporting the war, while the Ukraine does, because that's what they've been relying on from the very start. Therefore, even if stalemate right now, if in the future less funding, then it doesn't become equal anymore. And then you suddenly start losing, which is the result that happens on their side of the house. So they must commit that in order to maintain a nominal stalemate, you must give accelerated funding to match the funding being tapered off, because in the past, right, it's only been one-off burst of funding that's not been renewed in the status quo. But secondly, and more importantly, even if you buy that you can maintain a stalemate without actually any funding progress, right? Notice what a stalemate just means is that you can't have a domineering, decisive victory in war. That does not mean that you cannot make marginal changes on the battlegrounds on the field conditions, right? That tangibly change the lives of Ukrainians on the ground. What do I mean by this? It means that it is still a nominal stalemate, even if I shift slightly the battle lines, right? To show that one more oblast, one more province, one more city is being kept within my air defenses, for example. Notice that if I buy one air defense thing for my town, right, I'm not actually winning the war, but I'm able to protect this town from Russian missiles, therefore saving, hundreds of thousands of people who are living in air blocks, being able to go to sleep at night without being woken up by air raids, or more importantly, without never being waken up at all because the bomb had destroyed their building before they're able to wake up at night. Here's the crucial comparative panel, that even if the material situation of the war doesn't change, even if Ukraine does not win the war, by being able to invest in one more air defense system, being able to shift the lines just a little bit further, right, we're able to protect entire provinces of people by giving them some semblance of normal reality, normal living, and normal life. There's the true comparative in this debate. They cannot simply assert that stalemate means nothing changes, because things actually do tangibly change in this debate. But fine, what do they tell us about Russian escalation? They said, oh, this will be the tipping point for China and Russia and India to come in. And I want to note here that they can't just say tipping point. We can actually explain what the tipping point really is. I want to note here that on their side, two things, like notice on their side, right? They still do two things. Firstly, they still give some degree of aid towards Ukraine, as I mentioned in both speakers. Secondly, they still take the Russian frozen assets away from them. So I'm not actually clear to me, right, what actually changes on their side. Because if China's condition for, reacting is asset forfeiture, they'll do so regardless. If China's condition for invading is, like supporting Ukraine, that is still the case. In fact, even if it's not materially the case right now, it is still historically the case. We've had 2 full years of substantial EU funding and US funding, and yet not a single whisper from these two countries about, I don't want to be associated with the West. So I'm not actually clear what Russian aspiration on their side really looks like. But more importantly, there's so many more reasons that prevent people from putting additional funding or boots on the ground. A lot of the issues, for example, of like Russian grain being limited or like oil prices rising also affect China, also affect India. They face their own domestic issues of Modi, for example, just losing his substantial power in the election, or China facing sluggish growth right now. It's unclear to me without further mechanization how they can just speculate that China and India, because they are not really Western countries, will now suddenly wish to invade on their side of the house. But what's most important is we have no response on their side to 2 further mechanisms from both Wei Loh and Caleb, right? But how on our side we bring to the negotiating table by holding this large carrot over his head. And what Wei Loh told you about greater international buy-in. Notice that these arguments are still standing by the end of the route, which means that in our very, very worst case, you still believe that we protect one additional Ukrainian town from being invaded by missiles. But in the best case, you're able to believe that some actual incremental change in the war does occur, which I think we win by default on the comparative. But sure, let's talk about EU funding on their side of the house. There are a couple of responses that I need to bring up first. Firstly, they don't actually prove a direct link on the counterfactual on their side as to how they can actually redirect funding and have the political capital for it. Notice the motion does not give them the fiat to assume that the political capital that allows you to take assets for Ukrainian funding allows you to do the same for EU funding. I'll note, in fact, that if given the general preference for a rule-based international order, right, and general respect for property, there is a justification in this case for taking assets for Ukrainian funding because it is actually using it against the aggressor, right? There's far less legal justification for taking it for your own personal consumption. So in fact, if these EU states are relatively interested in maintaining some sort of international order, right, they won't have the political capital to do what the side assert they're able to do. But more importantly, here's the critical thing, right? On their side, actually on our side, funding Ukraine, right, actually solves a lot of issues that they want to talk about, right? It is through Ukrainian funding that blocked, for example, the Russian blockade of Crimea, which allowed for Ukrainian grain exports to occur, therefore reducing grain costs in the past year, right? Similarly, on their side, if they allow Ukraine to capitulate to complete Russian aggression, or even in fact more Russian aggression, this simply drives more Ukrainian refugees towards EU states, therefore needing more EU funding being directed to refugee camps and refugee support for neighboring states that neighboring Ukraine, like Poland, for example, right? So on their side, actually, the fact that they're less able to stand Russian aggression also directly leads to more funding limitations being imposed on these EU countries. So I'm not clear on their side how 3 billion is too little to give to Ukraine. I'm not sure how 3 billion is somehow substantially enough to give to 18 different EU countries with very disparate needs that also accentuates the root causes of the problem. I'm very proud to stand in proposition.
Thanks for that speech. And now I'd like to invite the negative.
Am I visible and audible?
Yeah.
Okay, just setting a timer. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, now. Ukraine rely on EU support in the war, but if the EU has economic problems in itself and get worsened to a severe extent, it won't be able to support Ukraine in the long run or anymore. Prop is very optimistic throughout this debate. Their logic is money is important and it helps Ukraine so much, like giving them air forces, like giving food to the soldiers, but forgot to consider 2 things. 1, what is the likely reaction of Russia? And secondly, then, what is the economic capacity of EU? Insofar as this is a long-term war, it's not going to end in the short term. So, therefore, long-term support is very crucial. They cannot get that in their side of the house if EU itself has severe economic problems and unable to sustain Ukraine in the long run. Our stance is pretty clear at the end of this debate. Pushing from our first speaker, they will keep the money generated from the Russian assets inside EU and will give out the money if in urgent need in the long run. I will do 2 things in my speech. Firstly, clashes. Secondly, weighing. On the first clash, then, about Ukraine's survival. First is what they mentioned in the status quo, Russia is in a very advantageous stage. 1, in the status quo, the situation, as what their first speaker depicted, is a stalemate. Russia and Ukraine is both burning out resources and money, and thus it's not likely for Russia to have financial power to impose devastating movements in the status quo. No, stalemate is beneficial for Ukraine more, because when we push from the DLO and they never respond, is that Russia has high cost of transfer supply lines. They have to shift all the resources from central Russia to Ukraine that costs a lot of money and time. But secondly, then, even if we take their argument, if Russia is in a very advantageous state, then there's a strong incentive for Russia to actually keep it this way so it can win the war. Given it's a very aggressive actor, which the mechanism proved that Russia actually has the incentive to escalate if their advantageous state is being taken away by Ukraine. That's why escalation will still happen. I'm going to deal with that later on. But thirdly, even if stalemate is so harmful, that's what they're trying to depict it for Ukraine. If right now EU has to pour those weaponaries to Ukraine using Russian assets, this will actually break this equilibrium and thus piss off Russia, leading to escalation. Russia has last second plan, i.e. the money get by selling oil to China can be used to purchase arms. That is to say, we would rather have stalemates rather than escalation for Russia because of two reasons. One, know that escalation is more detrimental. It involves a more catastrophic moves compared to stalemate. But secondly, then, Ukraine's being hurted the most during escalation. Russia has China to back up and has a huge support by secretly purchasing oil from Russia because this is cheap. This will respond to the second speaker, and China is not in favor to the West country at all, as my DLO already explained. They have no engagement at all. Even in places, and also even in places like the USA, where your country is going to back up Ukraine, Ukraine's going to be hurted the most if escalation or this war continues, because how Ukraine's put in the middle of two superpowers. But secondly, then they mention. But secondly, let's consider the point about the capacity to help, right? If they really want to help Ukraine, they first have to prove that EU has the ability to long-termly sustain Ukraine in the first place, to continue financial aid to Ukraine in the long run. Note, we already explained that EU is currently suffering from an economic crisis, like the electricity price is super high in European countries because of Russian sanction. This means if money don't use to sustain EU itself, it will worsen the economic crisis and potentially leading to collapse. I already explained how that's detrimental. This means if the EU is having a bad economy, they're unable to fund Ukraine in the long run or even in the short run. This is a worse off situation in their side of the house. As my second proposition, what is the second proposition speakers respond? Their only response was two things. One, they can get the money from taxation. Second, then, is Ukraine people need more of the money. Three things to take their own response out of this debate. One, increased tax has harmful effects. It hurts people in European regions that have to pay high prices for electricity or basic water necessities. It exhausted the economy in European regions. And no, the tax also has limits. You have to stop tax people at some extent. You cannot charge people 90% of taxes of their income. The trigger local revolts, meaning tax is not a long-term solvency. But secondly, then, we don't understand how this can actually solve the economic crisis in their side of the house, when ultimately the money inside the economy is at that much. And then if we don't pour additional money generated by Russian assets, you just charge people taxes cannot fix the economic problem at core unless you gave strategic mechanism. But thirdly, their weighing measure is pretty weird. People in the EU are still people. We don't understand how this is not as important as people in the Ukraine. But rather, since EU is most responsible and own the most obligation to their own people, as they're the people who's contributing to the prosperity of the country, as already explained in the second speaker, we would like to argue at the worst case, they still own the obligation more than to the people of Ukraine. What's the main metric then? The impact that proposition is trying to prove at the end of the day is saving life on the ground. How do we outweigh in their side compared to their side? Firstly, on a time frame. If we're able to sustain EU in the first place of economic crisis, as we mentioned in the first speaker, they have not responded yet at the end of the debate, we're able to have more money to actually sustain Ukraine in the long run. But secondly, then, as I mentioned about obligation, that EU is only the most obligation to its people, and secondly, that is going to be Ukraine. Thirdly, their impact is very uncertain. They have to prove simply by dumping weapons and giving those weaponaries in Ukraine can end this war easily, or at least not prolong it. Meaning people still die out in their side of the house. They don't get to link in the impact they want at the end of the day. Second question on Russia escalation. They try to say Russia will not escalate because it has no capacity, it has no incentive. One, they have to prove why Russia has no incentive to escalate, but rather already use their own mechanism to prove why Russia has a strong incentive to escalate by telling you how Russia has incentive to keep the advantageous stage as they depict using their own mechanism. And also we give three additional reasons coming from the first opposition speaker, no response at the end of the day. Secondly, then, Godslove response is say, at either side, we take assets from Russia anyway, so Russia's going to piss off in either side of the house. Note, the crucial differentiation we draw from our first and DLO is by telling you, in their side, you're directly dumping the money generated from assets to the people they're competing from Russia. Russia's currently fighting, which is Ukraine. It's a huge difference. If you actually pour your money to someone who you're actually competing with, we think Russia's far more likely to get pissed off in their side of the house. But thirdly, note that as we mentioned in our argument, that Russia has a backup, such as China and India. And we already mentioned how in Lee Loh, how China has incentive to actually help Russia secretly purchasing oil, no matter if it's going to help Russia to give weaponaries or so what, at least China's purchasing products from Russia, and that's enough because it gives money to Russia to continue having those weapons. And also, this is what's going to happen in the status quo. They cannot deny the fact. This means in their side of the house, Russia will ultimately actually, because in their side of the house, Ukraine will ultimately get left behind in the war. In their side of the house, if the EU having the economic problems in there itself and unable to actually solve it in time and get severe time by time, that's how in their side of the house, Ukraine will see sole and only support and thus unable to compete with Russia. At the end of the day, what is the weighing done? We think at this extent, one, there's going to be more people dying out in their side of the house if the EU, sure, at the short term, able to give money, but in the long term, it leaves Ukraine in the war alone. We don't think that save people at any extent. But speaking that, additional sacrifice is going to happen in their side of the house for people who's actually living in Europe who had to afford such a high price to pay for electricity and water, which means that even at the worst case scenario, at least we make sure the economy in EU is okay before helping Ukraine, which means that if this debate is truly about Ukraine, we did far more better in the long run if we can actually sustain the economy in EU and thus better support Ukraine. For all those reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
Great. Thanks for that speech. I'd now like to invite Neg reply.
Time starts in 3, 2, 1. We believe that the most important thing in this debate is which option or which choice will keep the most people safe, increase the quality of people's life most, and overall benefit everyone, not just Ukraine. The opposition believes that the best way is to use the money generated to rebuild the EU and doesn't have to give all the profits to Ukraine. So, firstly, a commonly debated topic earlier in this debate was whether the conflict will escalate at all in the first place. And AF says that it won't. But they say that if you actually escalate this, if you actually give more support to Ukraine, then Russia will choose to go to the negotiation table. And that we talked about how other countries, India and China, will try to resolve the conflict or try to change the result of the Ukraine-Russian war. And they said that India wanted to resolve the conflict like many other nations. So, and here we already mentioned how China didn't have ties to most European countries and didn't have a reason not to support Russia. They also said that Putin would have a reason to leave the war, and there is actually a lot of reasons why Russia has ideological reasons to fight this war and to continue fighting it. A problem of its image to the fatherland, political reasons, how it's already committed. There is a lot of reasons why Russia will choose to continue this war until it simply can't. And if you give Ukraine all the profits all at once, then Russia would simply not, would simply just overcome that or would just hold on instead of going to the negotiation table. Moreover, even if the war doesn't actually escalate, given reasons why maintaining we have given reasons why maintaining a stalemate right now is better. The EU and the US is already supporting Ukraine right now and is committing a few billions over the past 2 years. So it doesn't make sense why they would stop now. We're not telling them to stop, but we're saying that these profits from the frozen assets shouldn't have to go to Ukraine. And by maintaining the current support, we would be able to maintain a stalemate until eventually Russian forces simply cannot last any longer because there is no countries giving Russia the same support. And just by maintaining a stalemate, Russia will be forced to give up eventually. So where do we think this money should go instead? To the EU, and if there is any extras, it could go to Ukraine rebuilding after the war. Firstly, EU has an obligation to itself, and we don't see why it is most important that Ukraine wins this war. We consider all the different nations involved in the EU, all the citizens involved in the EU, has an obligation to itself and should also have quality of life that needs to be maintained. And the invasion of Ukraine cost the EU dearly. The prices of energy actually skyrocketing. Overall resources were committed to Ukraine to support their defense, and overall the EU still owes a duty to their own people first. There's weaker nations like Hungary on the border of conflict and dangerously leaning towards Russia. We need to support these countries just as much as we need to make sure that the people in these Ukraine-Russian war are also supported. And there's also reparative duties. Because Russia launched a crime of aggression, there is direct reparative duties to the Ukrainian people. But the problem is the EU has been supporting them for the longest time, and if the EU really wants to continue to support them, pragmatically, the Ukrainian war is basically a drain on EU. So what we need to do first in order to actually maintain this current situation is to help the EU before we help the Ukraine. And we don't think this would mean that there is no support given to the Ukraine, simply that the current support is continuing to be given while other countries and nations can continue to rebuild through the profit and frozen assets. For these reasons, we oppose.
Thanks so much, Dig Reply. I'd now like to invite Af Reply.
Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
We're going to look at three actors in this debate: Europe, Ukraine, and Russia, and explain to you why, even if you want to adopt their side weighing metrics, we win on these three grounds. Firstly, let's talk about the EU. The first thing and important to note is that this is not an actor debate. It is really befuddling how side opposition seems to think that this is an as EU we would do X motion, because really there owes no reparations towards Europe. Nobody would doubt that Ukrainian person is suffering a lot more than the average European. In Ukraine, where 44% of their population is leaving the country, where a quarter of their GDP has literally been shaved off, where people are literally dying on the streets from a lack of food. I don't see people fleeing Berlin because of low electricity prices, but I've seen people live here. We agree the situation there is not great, but we think that the life of Ukrainians we have consistently proved is more important. But here's the thing, let's adopt their weighing metric. Let's say it is the EU person's life that is more important. It is under our side that when we stop Russian aggression, they were able to provide that consistent flow of funding. They were able to help them better because we reduced grain costs, because we're able to kick down the blockade that Russia imposed on Crimea, because we're now able to say stop the flow of Ukrainian refugees, be able to provide them better living conditions in Ukraine itself, alleviating the load for the EU. If DESAT wants to solve the economic problems that the European is facing, outside does it better. We win on their metric. But let's look now on Ukraine. DESAT adopts Ukraine as their secondary objective. They say, we help EU first, then after that we help Ukraine. DESAT assumes that they can maintain the stalemate now, but that doesn't mean they can attain the stalemate in the future. Our side is the one that actually adopts a stalemate and therefore means that Ukraine does not lose, ensuring the Ukrainian survival that we felt was extremely important. Under their side of the house, funding is A, very inconsistent, because oftentimes politicians have other objectives, and B, funding would be likely to evaporate because the issue of Ukraine is becoming less important in people's minds and not more important. Therefore, there's a higher probability that Ukraine is going to lose. Let's look at the two possibilities in their world. Either their side believes that they genuinely want to help Europe before helping Ukraine, as the third opposition speaker says, in which case they will probably stop all funding for Ukraine now. Missile maintenance don't work. Their side doesn't have artillery against Russian planes. It means Ukraine collapses and all of the harms that were incurred that they never touched actually accrue. Meanwhile, if their side actually believes that Ukraine is important, what it means is that they're going to fund Ukraine anyways. And here's the question: why then leave it in the hands of the European Parliament and people like Viktor Orban rather than giving them something consistent such that they can forward plan and have greater consistency and certainty to do? Even if we adopt their side's most charitable characterization, which is that in the long term, they're able to secure support for Ukraine, I don't see why that kind of support is very useful if it is not consistent, if it is not certain. I don't see why it is much better than the kinds of money that we can provide in order to ensure that it's something they know month for month is going to happen. Finally, then, let's talk about Russia. Notice two things. Firstly, DESAT still takes away Russian assets. B, DESAT still wants to help Ukraine indirectly. This is the lens under which you should perceive all of the arguments about Russia. When DESAT says Russia is going to escalate under outside the house, notice that DESAT literally does exactly the same thing through a more roundabout way. I don't see why exactly DESAT has proven in this debate why Russia is now going to enter the tipping point where they're going to escalate. But what we told you was not that Russia has no incentive to escalate, but Russia doesn't have the ability to, and then outside the house, because they're already being stretched to their limits. This war began in February 2022, and we have not seen India, which is literally part of the Quad and literally has military alliances with the US, entering the fear with Russia. Finally then, on this issue of India and China, we have already explained to you that they are not best friends, that they are not going to enter this conflict. Our side provides an additional incentive for negotiating, and we think at the end of the day, the Russian aggression or antagonism that their side perceives is not as important as the Ukrainian survival and their sovereignty. For these reasons, we are proud to propose.
Thanks so much for